Will Carver had once stood proud in his marine dress blues, a pillar of unyielding strength and discipline, his medals gleaming under the sun during a parade in 1985. Now, at 67, he drifted nearly unseen through the weathered streets of Harborview, Maine, a coastal town whose heartbeat had faded with its shuttered fisheries and barnacle-crusted docks, the salty air now carrying whispers of better days. Each morning, Will slung his tattered duffel bag over one shoulder, the fabric worn thin like his own resolve, and shuffled through the fog-draped alleys and forgotten boardwalks, the cry of gulls overhead a mournful soundtrack to his solitude. Ever since Margaret, his wife, his North Star, succumbed to cancer, a battle they might have won had the VA hospital not dismissed her symptoms as mere fatigue for months, he had been adrift. He had sat by her bedside in their small clapboard cottage on Seaview Lane, watching the light in her sea-green eyes dim with each passing day, her hand growing colder in his. When the end came, Will honored her final wish, selling their home and donating the modest proceeds to the Harborview Animal Shelter, a place Margaret had cherished for its scrappy strays. Afterward, he vanished, not into the grave, but into a quieter kind of oblivion, the kind reserved for the broken-hearted and the forsaken. Some battles end with medals, Will murmured one icy morning to a weathered fisherman who handed him a thermos of lukewarm coffee outside the First Baptist Church, the man's calloused hands trembling in the wind. Others end with silence. Will never begged. He clung to the last shred of dignity he had, surviving by collecting glass bottles washed ashore, scrounging for change in the sand, and accepting the quiet kindness of places like the Salty Crab Diner, where waitresses like Jenny slipped him a mug of chowder or a stale biscuit without a word. Most folks, though, crossed the street to avoid him, their eyes averted from the man whose marine tattoos peeked from beneath his frayed sleeves. As December's biting cold settled into Harborview's bones, the wind howling off the Atlantic like a grieving widow, Will grew weaker. His coat, a relic from brighter days, was threadbare, the lining torn and useless against the frost. His boots' soles cracked like the town's old pier, leaden slush that numbed his toes. Hunger gnawed at him with a relentless ferocity, a beast he couldn't outrun. By the third day without a proper meal, his hands shook so violently he could barely grip the bottles he collected, his vision blurring with each step. That afternoon, dizzy and desperate, Will stumbled into Tidewater Market, a squat wooden building with a peeling sign and a sagging roof. The scent of damp wood and overripe produce a faint promise of survival. He lingered near the discount bin, a wooden crate marked clearance in faded chalk, filled with bruised pears and day-old bread rolls, their crusts hard but still edible. His stomach twisted, a sharp pang that doubled him over, his breath ragged in the cold air. No one seemed to notice him. The owner, Mr. Hargrove, a stout man with a perpetual scowl, was busy ringing up a lobsterman at the counter, the clink of coins a distant sound. The lone stock boy, a lanky teen named Ethan, was stacking jars of pickled herring at the far end of the store, humming off-key to a tune on his earbuds. Will hesitated, the weight of his conscience heavy as a ship's anchor, but hunger was a stronger force, a tidal wave that drowned his principles. With trembling fingers he slipped a bruised pear into the inner pocket of his coat, then a roll, the crust scratching against the fabric. His hands, stiff from the cold, fumbled to close the coat, his breath hitching as he shuffled toward the door, head bowed against the shame burning in his chest. A gruff voice cut through the air like a foghorn. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" Will froze, his heart sinking like a stone in the harbor. Mr. Hargrove stormed toward him, his face red with fury, his apron flapping like a sail. I, Will stammered, but the words caught in his throat. Hargrove was already reaching for the phone, his thick fingers jabbing at the buttons. "Police, now," he growled. "We don't tolerate thieves here." Will didn't resist. He stood there, hollow-eyed and exhausted, the pear and rolls still tucked inside his coat, a pitiful bounty for the price of his dignity. Within minutes, a squad car pulled up, its lights casting blue and red shadows through the market's frost-etched windows. 2 officers stepped inside, their boots heavy on the creaking floorboards. Officer Tom Bradley, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, spoke into his radio with a booming voice, while Officer Elena Rivera, her sharp hazel eyes catching the glint of Will's dog tags peeking from his collar, paused. "You served?" she asked softly, her tone cutting through the tension. Will managed a small nod, his voice a whisper. "Long time ago. When it mattered." Elena hesitated, a flicker of empathy in her gaze, but procedure was procedure. Before the handful of evening shoppers, a fisherman, a schoolteacher, a retired nurse, Will Carver was handcuffed and led out of Tidewater Market, his dignity stripped away like the peeling paint on the town's lighthouse. Outside, the wind whipped off the ocean, carrying the scent of salt and decay. Some onlookers stared, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. Others turned away, uncomfortable with the sight of a man they'd seen but never truly noticed. The mugshot captured not just Will's weathered face, but the deep lines etched there, not just by age, but by sorrow, loneliness, and a country that had once saluted him, but now barely acknowledged his existence. That night, in the municipal holding cell, Will sat on the narrow cot, the concrete walls cold against his back. He carefully drew a small, faded photograph from inside his shirt, Margaret, smiling on the beach, her hair blowing in the wind, her laughter frozen in time. He whispered into the empty room, his voice cracking. "I'm trying, love. I'm trying." Outside the barred window, the winter wind howled, the waves crashing against the rocky shore, and somewhere beyond, fate began to stir. Morning in the Harborview Municipal Court was a gray, mechanical affair, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, flickering like the town's flickering hope. The scuffed wooden floor echoed with the steps of the weary and the defeated. Will shuffled in with the others, his boots scraping tiredly, his tattered coat hanging from his bony shoulders, stiff with last night's damp cold. His wrists ached from the cuffs, though the officers had been gentle. It wasn't cruelty that bruised him, it was indifference. No family waited for him on the splintered benches. No friends whispered encouragement from the gallery. Just Will, hunched small at the defendant's table, his duffel bag tucked between his boots as if it might still hold something worth saving. The clerk, a young woman named Sadie with tired eyes and a monotone voice, read through the docket with mechanical precision. Case 19-842, the State versus William Carver. Will stood when his name was called, swaying slightly, his knees trembling like brittle driftwood. The courtroom murmured, a few curious glances landing on him before sliding away, some with disgust, others with hollow pity. At the prosecutor's table stood a young man named Nathan Brooks, crisp in his navy suit, his ambition as fresh as the ink on his law degree. Brooks spoke briskly, as if it were just another item on the morning's checklist. "Your Honor," he began, "the defendant was apprehended committing petty theft at Tidewater Market. Surveillance confirms the theft. The defendant has no fixed address, no employment, prior citations for loitering and public intoxication. The state recommends remand until trial to prevent further offenses." Judge Henry Ellison, a stern man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, barely looked at Will at first, his fingers tapping against the stack of reports on his bench. He moved through cases with the efficiency of a lighthouse beam cutting through fog, flipping open Will's file, expecting the same parade of despair he saw daily. Then something slipped loose between the papers, a scratched marine dog tag on a thin chain, clattering softly onto the judge's bench. Ellison stilled, his breath catching. He leaned forward and, for the first time, truly looked at Will. The name stamped into the metal hit him like a wave, Carver, William J. USMC, blood type A-. A memory surged, unbidden, Kuwait, 1991, the Gulf War, the searing heat of a desert ambush, the stench of burning oil and blood, the moment a Marine had dragged him from a flaming Humvee, bullets whizzing past, the man's own arm bleeding through a torn sleeve. "Request a 5-minute recess," Judge Ellison said abruptly, cutting off the prosecutor mid-sentence. The clerk blinked, startled. Brooks hesitated, his mouth half open. Ellison didn't wait for objections, rapping his gavel once, sharp and final. "Recess granted. Counsel, approach." He rose and disappeared into his chambers, leaving the courtroom buzzing with quiet confusion. Will stood there, dazed, his mind a fog thicker than the morning mist rolling off the harbor. No one had ever paused the relentless march of procedure for him before. He sat slowly, not daring to hope, his hands trembling in his lap. Behind the heavy oak doors of his chambers, Judge Ellison stood staring at the dog tag in his palm. William Carver. He closed his eyes, the years rolling back like the tide. That day in Kuwait, he'd been a young lieutenant, barely 25, pinned under wreckage, his leg shattered. Will Carver had hauled him out, ignoring the gunfire, his own wounds, his steady hands binding Ellison's leg with a torn strip of his uniform. Now, the same man sat in an orange jumpsuit over a pear and a roll, discarded by the system he'd bled for. Ellison sat heavily, the file open before him, each entry a knife to his conscience. Discharged honorably, 1992. 3 tours overseas. Bronze Star recipient. VA benefits terminated, 2008. Reason, no known address. Case closed. Closed, as if a man's life could be reduced to a clerical note and forgotten. Ellison ran a trembling hand through his hair, whispering, "God forgive us." He knew the law had failed Will long before this petty theft, abandoning him to the cold streets of Harborview. Back in the courtroom, Will hunched further into his seat, the air heavy with judgment. A young woman in the gallery, a local reporter named Clara Evans, watched him with curious eyes, scribbling notes for the Harborview Gazette. The minutes stretched, taut as a fishing line. At last, the doors opened, and Judge Ellison emerged, his face set with a gravity that silenced the room. He took his seat and looked directly at Will. "Mr. Carver," he said, voice low but firm, "before this court proceeds, I am ordering an immediate review of your military records and VA status. This case will be stayed until further notice." Brooks sputtered an objection, but Ellison silenced him with a raised hand. "Furthermore, this court is requesting assistance from the Veterans Legal Defense Network to provide Mr. Carver with pro bono representation, effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the room. Will blinked, not understanding, his mind struggling to grasp the words. Ellison leaned forward, his voice softening. "You are not invisible here, Staff Sergeant." The title hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Will bowed his head, hiding the sudden sting in his eyes, the first tears he'd shed since Margaret's funeral. Outside the courthouse windows, snow fell, soft and silent, blanketing the harbor in white. For the first time in years, Will felt a flicker, not of hope, but of its memory, a faint warmth in the cold. That night, in the silence of his cell, he sat on the narrow bunk, staring at the cracked ceiling. He cradled Margaret's photograph, her smile radiant even after all these years, a lighthouse in his storm. "If you're lost, Will," her voice echoed from a soft place in his memory, "it's not forever. I'll wait for you." The words had been her comfort during his deployments, whispered over crackling phone lines from bases half a world away. Now, in the sterile loneliness of Harborview's jail, they were all he had. The guards treated him with a polite distance, their voices clipped but not unkind. He ate a tray of watery fish stew and a stale roll, but most of it went untouched, his hunger replaced by a deeper emptiness. In the next cell, a young fisherman named Cody, all bravado and bitterness, sneered as Will shifted on his bunk. "Another old-timer thinking the world owes him," Cody muttered, loud enough for Will to hear. "Bet you made up those war stories. PTSD?" "Sure." When Will didn't respond, Cody shoved him as he passed to the sink, knocking Will against the metal bunk. Will caught himself, his hands gripping the frame, but he said nothing, no rage, no retaliation, just a quiet endurance honed over years of unseen battles. He pressed Margaret's picture to his chest, whispering, "Just holding on, darling. Just holding on." Across town, in his dimly lit chambers, Judge Ellison pored over stacks of documents, a pot of burnt coffee cooling beside him. He had pulled Will's military records, and each page tightened the knot of shame in his gut. Bronze Star for Valor, 1990, for shielding comrades during a mortar attack. 2 Purple Hearts for injuries sustained rescuing a civilian family during an ambush. Combat Action Ribbon for direct enemy engagement. Amid the commendations were notes of Will's humanity, letters from fellow Marines and Kuwaiti civilians describing a man who carried wounded children to safety, shared his rations with starving families, and taught young recruits to write letters home under the desert stars. A true guardian in the worst of storms. Ellison leaned back, covering his face with his hands. How had they let him slip through the cracks? The answer was stark: they hadn't let him slip, they'd pushed him. When Will returned from his final tour in 1992, Margaret had been waiting, her arms open on the pier. But untreated PTSD had eaten at him like rust on a ship's hull. When Margaret fell ill, he'd fought the VA's labyrinthine bureaucracy. But a missed appointment, a lost form, and their fragile life crumbled. By 2008, with Margaret gone, Will had no address to anchor him, no address, no benefits, no survival. Forgotten by the nation he fought for. Until now. Ellison reached for the phone, dialing the Veterans Legal Defense Network with a resolve as steady as the tide. The next morning, Will sat shackled in the transport van, the icy streets of Harborview bumping beneath him as he returned to the courthouse. He expected more of the same: hearings, hollow apologies, slow erosion. The bailiff unshackled him outside courtroom 3, his voice soft. "Straight inside, Sergeant." The word struck Will like a gust off the ocean. Inside, the atmosphere was different, the room filled not with indifferent onlookers but with soldiers. 3 Marine officers stood at attention in dress blues, their medals glinting under the lights. Behind them, a crowd of locals, veterans in faded caps, fishermen clutching small American flags, townsfolk who'd heard the story through Clara's article in the Gazette. Will stopped short, overwhelmed, his breath catching in his throat. At his defense table sat a sharply dressed woman, a leather briefcase beside her. She rose when she saw him. "Staff Sergeant Carver," she said, her voice steady. "I'm Lauren Harper, Veterans Legal Defense Network. I'm here to represent you." Will blinked, stunned. "I don't have money for a lawyer." "You don't need it," she replied with a fierce smile. "You have the truth." Judge Ellison adjusted his glasses and nodded at Will. "Mr. Carver, this court has been made aware of extraordinary circumstances regarding your history and service. We will hear critical testimony today on your behalf." Lauren placed a reassuring hand on Will's arm as Colonel James Carter, one of the officers, took the stand. In precise terms, Carter detailed Will's valor, his sacrifices, his loyalty, the lives he'd saved. He presented evidence that Will's VA pension had been wrongfully terminated, stripping him of financial security and mental health care he desperately needed. "The injustice inflicted upon this man," Carter concluded, "is a moral failure. It demands correction." The words echoed in the silent courtroom. Judge Ellison's voice broke slightly as he spoke. "This court recognizes Staff Sergeant William Carver not as a vagrant or criminal, but as a decorated hero whose dignity we failed to honor." He turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have anything further?" Brooks, his eyes glistening, shook his head. "The state moves to dismiss all charges, with prejudice." The gavel fell, sealing the words into record. Dismissed. Gone. The room erupted not into applause, but into a deeper reverence, people rising to their feet, hands over hearts, heads bowed. The Marine officer saluted Will, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Will Carver stood tall, unbroken, and seen. The moment stretched, a profound silence humming in his ears, the weight he'd carried for years lifting like fog under the sun. Slowly, shakily, he returned the salute, his hand trembling with the flood of emotion surging through him. The bailiff approached, his voice soft. "Sergeant Carver, you're free to go, sir." "Sir." The word tightened Will's throat as he stepped away from the table, the gallery parting like the sea. Near the door, a commotion stirred. A young woman with tear-filled eyes rushed forward, her scarf trailing behind her. "Uncle Will!" she cried. Will turned, bewildered. It had been years since anyone called him that. She threw her arms around him, clutching him fiercely. For a moment, Will stood stiff, stunned by the touch, then his arms came up to hold her, tentative at first, then tight. "It's me, Sophie, Margaret's niece." Will pulled back, seeing Margaret's laughter in the corners of her mouth, the same spark in her eyes. "I found you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've been looking since Aunt Margaret passed. You disappeared." Will's breath hitched. "I thought there was nothing left." "You're not alone," Sophie said fiercely. "Not anymore." Reporters snapped photos, but no one intruded, sensing the sacredness of the moment. Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow and the sharp tang of the ocean, a clean air of change. On the courthouse steps, Judge Ellison approached, his robe billowing like a sail. "You saved my life once, Staff Sergeant," he said, offering his hand. Will shook it, their grip a bond forged in forgotten wars. "Now I'll help you reclaim yours." True to his word, Ellison oversaw the reinstatement of Will's VA benefits, retroactively, with the Veterans Legal Defense Network moving mountains. The VA issued a formal apology after Clara's article went viral, delivering a check for $278,000 in back pay. More importantly, Will was enrolled in a veterans housing program, given comprehensive medical care, and welcomed into a community of veterans who understood his scars. A month later, Harborview held a ceremony at the town square, a celebration of valor. Banners fluttered along the docks, children waved flags, and old fishermen dusted off their navy caps. The Salty Crab donated chowder, a local band played sea shanties, and the air buzzed with reverence. When Will stepped onto the stage in his pressed marine blues, his medals gleaming, the crowd erupted into a standing ovation, the sound rolling like waves against the shore. Judge Ellison presented him with a plaque, "For service, sacrifice, and unseen valor, Harborview remembers." Will cleared his throat, gripping the podium. "I didn't save lives for medals," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I didn't fight for thanks. I fought because a man doesn't leave others behind." He paused, emotion blurring the crowd. "When you come home, you hope someone comes back for you. And you did." A hush fell, hearts breaking and mending as one. That evening, as twilight painted the harbor in hues of gold and indigo, Will sat on a bench by the pier, the same spot where he'd once eaten scraps with only the gulls for company. Sophie sat beside him, her head on his shoulder, a service dog named Anchor, donated by a Veterans Foundation, dozing at his feet. Children played nearby, their laughter mingling with the waves. The flag above the square fluttered, casting shadows across Will's face. He drew Margaret's photograph from his pocket, tracing her smile. "Found my way back, love," he whispered. "Just like you said I would." Above, the first star blinked into existence, and William Carver, invisible no longer, smiled into the night, knowing even the longest winters end, and even the most forgotten heroes can find their way home.